David Clark.
Well, it's a pleasure to rise and speak to the bill before us. And I want to start out by first congratulating my colleague Ian Lees-Galloway on the excellent work that he has done in getting this bill across the line. It speaks to basic Labor Party values, of course. The course of action needed was clear, but actually it's often hard to achieve the kinds of things we would like to achieve from the opposition benches. And I got a little taste of that with my Mondaysing bill to Mondays Anzac and Waitangi Day, which became law eventually, but against the government's will. When the government didn't want to make those changes, it took a great effort to get the smaller parties together to recognise the importance of making the change, and more importantly, perhaps even than that, to get the public of New Zealand behind a change and to enable them to understand the complex laws that get put through Parliament in a way that boils it down to the basic stuff. And so what we've got here in terms of 0 hours has been put out there into the wider realm, and 56,000 people, I understand, signed the petition to bring the end to that. And Ian Lees-Galloway has led that work, and we now have this positive change before us. So I congratulate him and others who have worked towards this end. Mr. Chair, how does this come to pass? How does it come to pass that we're in a world where we have this kind of insecure work? And there were submissions made to the Select Committee. I've flicked my eyes over a couple, and I've also seen the submission that people carried and used as a resource from the CTU on vulnerable work. And part of it is, of course, around the fact that we live in a globalised economy. Labor's Future of Work project is designed to deal with the issues that presents in terms of shifting to a higher value, diversified economy, the R&D tax credits that we know would make so much sense for our economy, the investment incentives to grow businesses that are in the waitlist sphere, and capital debt, Mr. Chair. But coming back to this particular aspect in terms of the 0 hours contract, 0 hours contracts that are going no longer to exist as a result of the excellent SOP of Mr. Lees-Galloway, that is there to protect the downsides of globalisation that we know will be there in the transition to this higher value economy that we want to have. It's to look after the vulnerable workers, to make sure that those who are in the position that they cannot negotiate against a global trend are protected. And so in the SOP, it's a very clear set of provisions that will be put in the law to make sure that those people are protected, that the vulnerable workers are looked out for, and that decent wages and decent working conditions can be guaranteed over time. Because nobody wants their kid, let's face it, nobody wants their kid or their workmate or their family member to be on a contract where they can't guarantee to pay the rent or the power or the food every week. Nobody actually wants that for anybody that they care about. And I don't believe that the majority of New Zealanders want that, and that's been shown in the incredible support for these changes that have been brought through in Part 2 of the bill, in the wider social movement that has supported that, and in support within this House eventually for getting rid of 0 hours contracts. So again, my congratulations to Mr. Lees-Galloway. His SOP amends Clause 87 to ensure that there are guaranteed hours to start with, to make sure that any contract that has flexibility within it does actually have those guaranteed hours. You can't start with 0 hours guaranteed. And then if you are going to have some on-demand aspects of a contract, the employer is now required, through the changes being proposed, to be specific about when and how those changes would take effect. So they can't just pluck something out of mid-air. They can't pluck something unreasonable out of mid-air. Now look, most employers, we all know and would acknowledge in this House, wouldn't do that. This legislation, like much of the legislation we put through this House, is designed to guard against the worst abuses that can happen when employers who are not good employers and often are not very effective or profitable in their businesses resort to the weaknesses that they can see in order to make ends meet, and that ends up harming people and stopping them meeting their ordinary everyday commitments, their ability to commit to a mortgage. We know we've got the lowest home ownership rate in New Zealand since 1951, and that problem is just getting worse every year, and it's because of labour provisions like this that people cannot commit to that future expenditure. And so that is why this SOP from Mr. Lees Galloway is so important. The second thing his SOP does is ensure that there are genuine reasons. There must be reasonable grounds for having an availability provision at all in an employment agreement. So they have to meet a test of reasonableness, and they have to have specific provisions. They can't just be provisions that they can be varied. They must specify why and for how many hours. And that is clearly specified in Mr. Lees Galloway's SOP. And the third thing that is very clear to me in there is that a shift cannot be cancelled at all unless the employee's agreement specifies it. It must be done with a reasonable notice of cancellation. Mr. Chair.
Stuart Nash.
Mr. Chair.